Hi, I'm Damian with Florio.
And I'm Aubrey, Leasure.
And Kendall no actually has a game today. She's on the cross team, so she couldn't make it. But our topic is systemic racism, and what we wanted to look at was the roles that ethnocentrism and racism play in the relations between the U.S. and the Middle East.
So this picture is from our Honors Intercultural Communications class last semester, and we as a class had the opportunity to be extremely involved with the Bruni scholar, Dr. Najib Hashimpour. And he was from Iran, and he posed the question to us in one of our discussions: why the Middle East, and why is it getting so much negative coverage? Why are we referring to extremist groups such as ISIS as Muslim extremist groups? And so before this question, we didn't really see that there was a problem with our media. But now that the discussion has been opened, we see that the ideas floating around in society today and in the media are in fact racist. And so this question is, why the Middle East? The agenda setting theory tells us that the media has power over us to set the agenda of what they want us to be thinking about, and not necessarily that it reflects public opinion. And so going back to Dr. Hashimpour's question, why the Middle East? Well, simply put, because the media wants us to be thinking about it and wants us to think that that's a salient topic. Next, we have the cultivation theory, and that's explaining that the media tells us what to think. And so the idea of the theory is that once we are more exposed to the media can implant fear in our minds. And so in relation to the Middle East, the more we hear about negative stories of the Middle East and scary stories that are happening in the Middle East, we're indoctrinated with fear about people from the Middle East and the area in and of itself.
So in order to get a good sense of this, we wanted to look at what is the average American perceived as by non-Americans. And fortunately, Kendall had the opportunity to interview some of the Canadian cross players here at RMU, and they described the average American as fast-paced, high-achieving, and generally very friendly. However, they also found that there was an emphasis on racism here in the U.S. that they didn't really see in their home country as much. In fact, one of the players went on to say that in Canada, we don't really care where you're from or what your background is. It's not really talked about. Americans show a sense of ignorance towards racial issues here, and it's evident in the media. Now, what is the average American actually like? We tend to be very opinionated on certain controversial issues, whether or not we have good information that we get. And unfortunately, a lot of the information that we can find online today is pretty biased. And so with this biased information, we tend to make assumptions, and this creates kind of a constant cycle of these first three prompts. This isn't necessarily the truth for all or even most Americans, but the majority of racism that we see between Middle Eastern groups in the U.S. stems from those first 3 points. But this can depend on the socioeconomic class. For example, higher social classes have more access to formal education at universities, so they're able to become educated on these issues and figure out who are these people, whereas lower classes may not necessarily have this opportunity.
So we also looked at the double standards here that Americans have. And in general, Americans look at religious terrorism completely different than they look at domestic terrorism, and they view it more critically. We looked mostly here at the major shootings of Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and the most recent one in December, San Bernardino shooting. And while the San Bernardino shooting was classified by definition as an act of domestic terrorism, Americans and the media portrayed it as an act of religious terrorism. And therefore, it was viewed completely differently and more harshly.
So, ethnocentrism. The first question we asked was, what role does American pride play in this ethnocentrism? Because pride can have a sort of negative connotation associated with this word. So, American pride is a good thing to have, but unfortunately sometimes it comes with this us and them mentality. We're right, we're the best country, which is a great thing to have in terms of building a foundation that we have for the past several hundred years. But unfortunately it comes along with this ignorance. We don't want to learn about other people since we're right all the time. And so we make these assumptions that I mentioned before. The next slide is an example of Daniel Tech's response to Majid's question, why the Middle East? Daniel is from New York, and he actually watched the Twin Towers go down when he was very young, and this was his response. He said, I have no idea when the people of the Middle East began hating Americans. All I've known growing up is that they hate us, and in turn we hate them. My limited exposure to the issue leads me to believe it all stems from political differences in the war for energy. Since the rise of terrorism, people have redirected the focus away from the need of oil and gas to the fact that extremist groups have killed our people. It seems that the Middle Eastern terrorists target areas all over the world, and I have no reason and choice to conclude that they are the ones involved. So the next thing we looked at involving ethnocentrism is, are millennials more tolerant? And an article produced by the Chicago Tribune in 2010 said, yes, in fact, millennials are a bit more tolerant. However, a more recent article produced by the New York Magazine said that, yes, as a whole generation, millennials are in fact more tolerant, but white millennials tend to be nearly as racially biased as their older white counterparts. You see, the reason that millennials are considered more tolerant is because in our generation, there's now more non-white individuals. And the last question we looked at involving ethnocentrism is, are we a product of our environment? Is this something that's been forced upon us, taught upon us? And sociologists would argue to a degree that any kind of fear we have it's culturally taught who and what to fear. This is actually a quote from Professor Maria Olsen-Mera here, or you, and she's a sociology professor here. And she also mentioned that what we fear are presumptions we make about other people and generalizations and categorizations we make depends on time periods. For example, if you were born at a different time in the 1900s, you may have prejudices against people from Vietnam because of the Vietnam War, or you might not like the Japanese because of Pearl Harbor. The focus today is shifted on the Middle East because of 9/11.
So finally, we wanted to get a whole scope of the issue, and we wanted to interview some Middle Eastern students. So we interviewed 2 students, one from Saudi Arabia and one from Egypt, who came to school in the United States. And we asked them their perceptions before they came to America. And they noted that they thought people in America were friendly, tolerant, and safe people. And this was actually based on the perception they got from their media. But one of the most important things we noticed was one of the students that came from Saudi Arabia was actually the victim of an act of violence in America. And instead of harboring hatred towards the perpetrator for that, he simply responded, and I quote, "It was just kids that committed this act, and they still do not yet know about the world." And so we, as a group, thought that this was a great understanding that we could adopt as Americans, and we could begin to adopt this attitude of forgiveness towards violence rather than reciprocation. And finally, we asked them about their issues with extremist groups. And they said that extremist groups perpetuate stereotypes about Middle Easterners and Muslims alike, and also, in some cases, they promote Islamophobia. The student from Egypt said that extremist groups give a completely false and negative image of Muslims. Both students that we interviewed were also extremely unsupportive of these extremist groups and said that the amount of Arabs and Muslims who are unsupportive is more than what we think. And that's contrary to what our media wants us to think.
So, systemic racism. Here's a really simple definition of racism. It is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. And if you look at this definition, to us, there was really 3 major things that popped out. The superiority, which seems to stem from the ethnocentrism. We're right, we're the best. Why should we care what you think, what you have to say, or even about me? The next thing was the prejudice, and this stems from the ignorance and the bad information. People are very, very motivated to get emotional about their opinions on controversial issues. And unfortunately, emotions aren't really a good source of information. And discrimination, finally, which is the act itself, stems from the prejudice and the fact that the media, to an extent, perpetuates fear. So we can see that in these 3 points right here, they actually kind of fit this definition, this basic definition of racism, in terms of how Americans tend to see a lot of the Middle East. And this is a sad thing. You see, Americans are afraid that, to an extent, if we have to learn about other countries, we'll kind of assimilate into them and we'll lose our own cultural identity. You don't have to lose your cultural identity to learn about these other places, just like these other countries and cultures haven't lost their identity learning about us. If we could learn to humanize and understand about these different people, it couldn't necessarily solve a major issue, but it would be a step in the right direction towards ameliorating the conflicts between the U.S. and the Middle East. Thank you. Now I'll entertain any questions. Yes.
Could Did your research lead you in any unexpected directions with the information you uncovered that you found surprising, either in the interviews or in the actual documents you looked at, the statistics?
Specifically, I thought that millennials as a whole being less racially biased would be kind of a true thing, but to find that white millennials tend to underestimate their racial bias was kind of interesting for me and a bit surprising. And it was neat to, I think, to include it in the PowerPoint for the sake of time, but there is this chart that showed that, basically, like I said, white millennials and older white Americans tend to think along the same ways. The difference was that the white millennials are more deluded into thinking that they're in fact more racially tolerant than white.
Yeah, I noticed that with individuals, when we looked at them on a personal basis, whether it was Americans, Canadians, or people from the Middle East, they seem to be more tolerant of each other on an individual basis, but when we put them into a whole group, when they're especially affected by media, that's when we really start to get the issues between the two or three or many major groups in the world.
Yes.
Did you find a difference in the way that the U.S. portrays in the media the Middle East and vice versa? Like how you said that their perception of Americans was far different than what they.
Yeah, so going into that was one of our major questions, especially because it was posed by the Rooney Scholar. And from our interviews with the two Middle Eastern students, we found that their media didn't seem to portray us as negatively as we expected them to. And in general, but not always in the cases, American media tends to portray the Middle East as a scary and negative place.
One interesting thing that Dr. Hashim brought up was that people in the Middle East are actually watching what's going on in the election right now in the U.S. because it's so important and crucial to the relationship we have with them. And I thought that was really surprising and interesting as well. Okay, go ahead.
So you mentioned the individual student testimonials, how people's perception of America before they came here, that were friendly and tolerant, and then you have the other side where the government is saying the exact opposite. Do you feel that the government is misinformed of the people that do perceive America in a right way? Why do you think they wouldn't focus on that more?
That's kind of where ethnocentrism, I guess, plays a role, the same way our media does, because we as individuals don't necessarily see the Middle East as a negative place, but yet our media is portraying that. So I guess you could say the same thing for those students. They don't necessarily see us that way, and they see us as safe, tolerant people. But again, their media plays a role, but they seem to be less affected by media.
And one of the most common myths is that these governments are involved with ISIS and these extremist groups. They're really not. In fact, these extremist groups are really the minority over in the Middle East. And that's what a lot of Americans don't seem to. I mean, I didn't know that until we kind of looked into this more. And a lot of Americans don't seem to understand that or are unwilling to an extent. Okay. Okay, guys, thank you very much.